All right, so it's 3 p.m. on my time, so I think we should get started. My name is Andre Porter. I'm the Science Policy Analyst for the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. And today we have Dr. Tricia Serio to give a talk on how to write an op-ed. In the month of March, ASBMB will be pushing forward for initiatives to encourage members of ASBMB as well as the scientific community as a whole to write op-eds in their local newspapers about the importance of science in their lives as well as in the lives of their neighbors and their communities. Today we have Dr. Tricia Serio, who is the Dean of the College of Natural Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she has been writing op-ed pieces for a while now. She's published pieces in Huffington Post, Chronicles of Higher Education, U.S. News and World Report, Nature, The Hill, Medium, and the Arizona Daily Star, to name a few. Dr. Serio serves on ASBMB's Public Affairs Advisory Committee and brings a wealth of knowledge on how to write op-eds and how to engage in advocacy. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Dr. Serio for, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box. We will do a Q&A at the very end, so please hold your questions, or your questions will be addressed rather at the very end. So feel free to fill it up and we'll knock them out with as much time as we have. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Serio.
Thank you, Andre. I appreciate this opportunity. And thank you all for joining us, especially on a Friday afternoon. As Andre mentioned, I've been writing op-eds for a little while now. I published my first one in December of 2015. And this week I just submitted my 17th op-ed. So after having never written one before, I've really spent a lot of time over the past couple years doing this. And I hope that you'll see that the activation energy for starting to do this uh, is not as high as you might think, and it's really quite an enjoyable thing. Now, what I hope to do today is to give you an overview of what an op-ed is and to give you an idea of one way to go about writing one. There are certainly many different ways, and I don't mean for this to be formulaic at all, but the structure that I'm going to present to you is a nice way to get started, at least. So to begin with, what is actually an op-ed? Op-ed refers to that ancient pastime of reading in printed newspapers where opinion pieces were published on the page opposite from the editorial page. So that's where the term op-ed comes from. And an op-ed is basically an evidence-based argument that's timely and of public value. So really, what the goal here is to make an argument based on evidence that you pull from your own sphere of knowledge that could be of interest to the public, that speaks to an issue that is in the current public discourse. So it's an opportunity for you to contribute your opinion to the public debate on any given topic. Now, the process for putting together an op-ed, to start with just a broad overview, can be broken down into 4 steps. Obviously, the first thing that you have to do is to come up with an idea. What is it that you're interested in talking about, and how is that related to what's going on in public discourse at any given moment? Once you have an idea, then the next thing that you should undertake is to draft an op-ed. Because much like the writing that you might be more used to, scientific writing, you have to have a piece completely written in order to try to get it published. The next step is then to develop a pitch. Once you have a piece written, you have to convince someone to publish it. And these pitches are an important way to frame your opinion and how it fits into the current public discussion. And once you have that pitch developed, you undertake what we'll call a shopping of the piece to various outlets. And this is much more rapid process than you're probably used to in scientific publishing. So it's possible to move through a number of different venues rapidly, and I'll talk more about that in a little while. Once you have an idea and before you actually start writing, there's a number of things that you have to think about in terms of how to frame the actual writing before you sit down to do it. So in terms of things to keep in mind, first and foremost, who are you speaking for? The orientation of the piece should be consistent throughout in order to be effective and to reach people. So some things to consider is your area of expertise or your unique perspective. And this is something that's not fixed for any one person. It changes depending on the piece that you're writing. So for example, I've written op-eds from my perspective as a mother. I've written them from my perspective as an administrator in a higher education institution. And I've written them from the perspective of being a scientist. So depending on what you're talking about, your perspective might change, but it's important to keep that perspective uniform throughout the piece in order to effectively reach your audience. Another thing to keep in mind is who you're speaking to. Your audience might be different depending on the piece that you're writing. You could speak to multiple different people on the same subject, but it's really important to choose one. So whose perspective are you trying to impact? For example, if I want to write something about science policy, I might pitch the argument to a university administrator, or I could pitch that same argument to a granting agency, or I could pitch to the audience of a legislature, for example. And depending on whose perspective I'm trying to influence, that will impact the content of the op-ed that I'm writing. The most important thing, I think, to keep in mind is that you're starting a conversation. As scientists, we're trained to, when we write, to convince someone that we're right. And op-eds are really not about that. They're about contributing our own unique perspective into a discussion of something that's timely. So one way to think about it is the difference between being right and being effective. If you're just trying to make an argument, you might alienate the people who you're trying to convince, because most likely they have a different orientation to the topic that you're writing about, which is what's inspired you to write in the first place. So it's important to consider what you're doing as putting an alternative perspective out into the public. So it's part of the discourse that can lead to policy change or decision making. Now, with all that in mind, your target is 600 to 800 words for a typical op-ed. So there's not a lot of room to make the points that you want to make. And that's why framing them from a single unique perspective and speaking to a single unique audience is so important. Because if you try to do too much in a piece that's 600 to 800 words, its effectiveness will really be not very high. So with those things in mind, how do we actually go about constructing an op-ed? So by way of example, I'm going to pull text out of my first op-ed, which was published in The Hill in December of 2015. And I wrote this op-ed at the time when it looked like there was going to be a shutdown of the government over budgetary issues. And I wanted to talk about the impact that funding or variable funding for science had on scientific progress. And so this is the link to the op-ed in case you want to look at it later, because as I said, I'll be drawing examples from the body of that op-ed to illustrate the points that I'm going to present to you. The first part of an op-ed is obviously the introduction. And within the introduction, the first paragraph is really the most important, in that I'm sure you know this from your own reading on the internet, that everyone's really busy and no one owes you their time. And so if you want a person to read your opinion, it's really important to grab that person's attention right up front from the beginning. Otherwise, they're not going to engage and read the entire op-ed. So a nice way to start, and again, I want to reiterate that this is not meant to be formulaic. It's just one example of how to do this. But a nice way to start in this framework is what we'll call a news hook, which is something that makes your op-ed timely. Remember that definition of an op-ed is that it's a timely topic. So things that you could use for a news hook could include something that's going on at the moment. So this is the first sentence of that op-ed that I mentioned that I published a few years ago. It looks like we've narrowly escaped another government shutdown over the budget. So what I tried to do here is to link the thing that I wanted to write about to something that just happened in the news. And in this case, it was that the shutdown had been averted. Now, once you grab the person's attention, they might have been interested in the government shutdown. This is enough to draw them in part of the way. But then you have to make a bridge to the point that you'd like to make. So in the op-ed that I wrote, this bridge or transition was to connect the government shutdown to the impact of variable and low funding on scientific progress. So my bridge sentence was to say, okay, we avoided the government shutdown, but this is really just a small consolation for us because we were expecting another year of poor funding for the NIH, whose overall funding has been dropping over the past 11 years. And then once I made that bridge from the government shutdown to funding for science, I ended that paragraph with my thesis or position or opinion, whatever you'd like to call it, which is that if we don't reverse the trend and reinvest in science, we're going to shut down scientific discovery. So this first paragraph, again, to reiterate, grabs the reader's attention by linking the thing that I want to write about to something that's just happened in the news, and then to transition from that news hook to the point that I want to make in the piece that I'm writing. So this would be an example of a first paragraph. Now, once you've pulled in the reader, now's the time to construct your argument to try to influence their thinking. And this is the body of the op-ed. The whole point here, again, is to construct an argument that's evidence-based. And a good rule of thumb for the number of words that we have to work with is try to introduce 3 different points that are backed by evidence. And you can embed links into a Word document by using Command K. And a window will pop up and you can put a URL in there to link to specific bits of evidence. Now, in my case, for the op-ed that I wrote, the 3 pieces of evidence that I included were you can use a range of things from statistics to news items to quotes. You can link to academic papers if that fits with the argument that you're trying to make. Or you can use your own experiences because remember, this is your opinion that you're putting forward, and so you can draw on your own life experience as a piece of evidence to support the argument that you're trying to make. Now, the 3 points that I made, I'll take you through them one by one. First is that scientific discovery takes time. So the argument that I was trying to make is if there's variable funding, that really will interrupt scientific progress, which occurs over a long period of time. And I used cystic fibrosis as an example because not long before I wrote this op-ed, the first approved drug for the treatment of cystic fibrosis was approved by the FDA. And I went into PubMed and I looked how many papers had been published about cystic fibrosis and over what period of time. And it was a very long period of time and a very large number of papers. So I used that information to make the argument that it takes a long time to make a scientific discovery with translational potential. The next point I made was that funding gaps cause scientists to leave the profession now. So if there's no funding in place, then people can't get paid, and they wind up leaving the pursuit of scientific discovery. And the third point that I made was that funding gaps also limit the number of scientists in training. So if people have fewer grants, that's fewer future scientists that can be trained. And that also leads to a slowdown in scientific discovery. So for the last 2 points about funding statistics, I drew from information that was available on the NIH website and also from a survey that ASBMB had done of members and about their frequency of applying for grants, about the number of people who they were training, and about those who were leaving the profession. So those are just some examples of how evidence can be used to bolster the thesis or opinion that you are trying to advance in your op-ed. Okay. The next point is to acknowledge that there are other perspectives out there. So you're writing from your own unique perspective, and everyone else who's engaging this debate will have their own unique perspective. So what you want to do is to acknowledge that there are other ideas out there. And we often call this the to be sure statement. So to be sure, you know that there's an obvious counter idea to the point that you're trying to make, or some argument against the point that you're trying to make. But the to be sure statement explains why, even in the face of those other perspectives or other evidence, that your opinion and your perspective still adds to the conversation. So it's kind of like acknowledging an obvious counter argument. You can think of it that way. And there are a couple of strategies to construct the to be sure statement. One is to acknowledge that there's another perspective, but then dismiss it as being not relevant to your particular point of view and explaining why. Another possibility is to validate it, say, yes, that is true, but the point that I'm raising is more important than that point. And a third strategy is to add a personal caveat. That might be true, but this happened to me, and that's why it's important. So to give you an example from the op-ed that I wrote, the obvious argument, or one of the obvious arguments that I thought, was that we've already invested so much in science. Why are we asking for more? And so I called that out as a truth. This country has already made a significant investment in science, and it's led to many of the advances from which society now benefits. So that's validation. But then I trumped that by saying scientific discovery is progressive. In the current system, in which there are many ways to exit the profession, and few, if any, to re-enter it, limits the pace of that discovery. So it's fine, we made all of those investments and all of those discoveries, but if we want to keep moving forward, we can't stop investing in science. So that's how one example of how you might construct a to be sure statement. Okay. So once you've acknowledged other perspectives, you have to try to wrap up everything that you've presented to give marching orders, essentially, to the group that you were trying to influence. So the conclusion can be really thought about calling the reader or the audience that you targeted to some action. Remember, the goal of the op-ed is to influence someone else's thinking. And the conclusion is your opportunity to point them in the direction that you'd like them to go. And it can be sometimes effective if you link your conclusion back to the news hook, because that's really what probably drew the person into your piece to begin with. So in the case of the op-ed that I've been using as an example, I talked about what we actually needed in terms of support for research funding in the short term, which is that longer block of text that's visible on the screen there, which I won't read to you right now. But the call to action is really in that last sentence where I say, to our representatives, I was writing to the legislature, I say, let's reestablish our long-term partnership before we reach a point of no return. We're committed, are you? So the idea here is that scientists are willing to do the hard work and stay in the profession for the long haul if the legislature adequately funds science to allow us to do so. So that was the call to action in the case of this piece in particular. Okay, so that gets you to about 700 words, I think that op-ed was. And once it's written, now you have to try to get it published somewhere. And this, as a scientist, was the hardest bit for me to get a handle on. This idea of making a pitch and putting your opinion out there for others to see and to comment on, and to frame it in a way that it would be interesting to a general audience. So there are a couple steps to do this. Some of them are logistic pieces in actually making the pitch. And the first thing is where? Where do you send your piece? One good way to go about this, as you're putting your piece together, you should be reading what's already been published on this topic. And it's a good idea to pay attention to where other op-eds on this topic have been published, because that indicates an interest on the part of the venue to publish pieces in this topical area. So that's one way to try to narrow it down. Another thing you might think about is the target audience. In my case, I sent that piece to the Hill because I was specifically trying to target lawmakers. So those are some ways that you can try to think about where to send your piece. Once you decide on where you'd like to try to send it, it's very easy to find on websites instructions for how to submit pieces. So for example, if you go to the Hill website and click the how to submit, you'll see this: to submit an opinion piece, please email, and then it'll give you an address to email to. So in the actual pitch itself, then, once you've decided where to send it and found the email address to do that, some places have a web portal, but by and large, most of them are still an email pitch. There are a couple questions that you should try to answer in the email that you send. And it's extremely important to be succinct in the email. Depending on the venue to which you submit your op-ed, they might get hundreds of submissions in a day. And if they have to read through a large body of text, they're not going to do it because there are just so many other options for them. So you have to get to the point extremely quickly. And there are 3 guiding questions that I'd suggest that you try to address in a sentence or 2 right at the beginning. First is, what is it? What's this piece that you've written? Second is, why now? Why are you talking about this topic now? Again, that can lead back to the news hook that you've picked. And why you? What is unique about your perspective, and how do you potentially speak for a group of people that have a similar perspective to you? Now, when I published the piece that I've been using as an example, I was a fellow of something called the Oped Project. And since this was my first piece, I worked with an editor to pitch the piece. And she actually sent it to the Hill for me to illustrate how to do a pitch. So here's the text that she wrote in the email. And you can see those 3 questions answered. So she says right in the beginning, I've got a piece here from Tucson Public Voice's fellow Tricia Serio, who heads the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology at the University of Arizona. The budget deadline extension notwithstanding, she and colleagues are bracing for another year of dismal NIH funding, which means she'll have to turn away hundreds of scientists seeking a job in her department alone. So in that first paragraph, she said who I was and why it was important for me to be talking about this, because it was going to impact my own department. And she linked it to the news hook, which is that the budget deadline was extended. And then in the next paragraph, she says, in this piece, she argues that keeping U.S. trained scientists in science depends on funding from the NIH. After years of reductions, many PhDs, especially new grads, leave the profession and are unlikely to return. Ultimately, this is slowing the pace of scientific discovery. So that's the what is this piece. So she summarized the thesis, or my opinion, in that second 2 sentences. And then finally, just a simple question. Can you use this for the Hill? So it shouldn't be any longer than this. The editor should be able to read through quickly and get an idea of those 3 questions. What is it, why now, and why you? A bit more logistical things for the pitch, which I'll call pointers. Put right in the subject of the email, in all capital letters, opinion, colon, and then put the title of your piece so that the editor knows without even opening the email what this is about. Second, it's a really good idea to paste the body of the piece, paste the piece into the body of the email as opposed to attaching it as a file. Because if you have to attach it as a file, it's one more thing for the editor to do, to click on the file. Whereas if they can just scroll down in their email, they might be more likely to actually read it when it comes in. And the third thing, which was one of the hard things for me, is how quickly this all goes. So it's not at all what you're used to if you think about scientific publishing, that most editors will respond in either 1 or 2 days or never answer your email. So you'll either get an immediate response or you never hear anything. So after, I would say on the 2nd day, you can follow up by email and say, I'm just following up on the email that I sent to you. If you're interested, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll move on tomorrow. So just to give them a heads up that you'll move on. And then just simply move on to the next venue and submit it again. This can go very rapidly. So just keep moving the piece forward as quickly as you can. You don't want the news hook to get stale. And if it does get stale, you should think about substituting another news hook for that one that you had in your original draft, if it's possible to do so. Okay, so that's about the pitch. Now, I mentioned that I've been writing a lot of these over the past couple years, and I've learned a few things in doing so. The first thing is have fun. This is a real opportunity for you to put your voice out there. When I first started doing this, I was really hesitant because I didn't think that I had anything to say that anybody would want to hear. And I quickly learned that even writing from multiple different perspectives, that people aligned with my thinking, and it was possible for me to speak for a broader audience. And it's a fun thing to be able to do that and to contribute to the public discourse and to see an impact. So have fun with it. Also, don't be discouraged. As I said, in this digital age, there are so many things submitted in so many venues. If you don't hear back or if they pass, just thank them and move on to the next place. There are so many options that you can get your pieces out there. There are also websites where you can self-publish, for example, Medium. All you have to do is sign up, and if you try to pitch it to a few places and it's not going anywhere, you can just self-publish on Medium, for example. And I've done that a few times, and in many ways, I think the pieces there get more widely read than in some of the more focused websites to which I've submitted. Also, once you actually get your piece, either self-published or published through another website, it's really important to share it on social media. So promote what you've done and share your thoughts through your social media platforms, whether it be Facebook or Twitter. However you connect with the world, you should let them know that you've written about a topic. And the most important thing is don't read the comments. That was something that I learned very early on. And this gets back to my original idea that you're not trying to win an argument, you're trying to start a conversation. So uh, sometimes people who have different opinions can be less than kind, and it's not a debate. It's really just putting your opinion out there, and they have the right to do that as well, but you don't have to read it if you don't want to. So that's, in a nutshell, how you go about writing an op-ed and pitching it and getting it published. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thanks, Tricia. Now I'll reiterate, if you have any questions, please either submit them in the chat or in the Q&A box. I'll lead off with the first question, and it kind of harkens back to your last statement about not reading the comments. Do you think that it is more beneficial to publish in a medium which is different from your own political leanings or different from your own position, because you're trying to start a conversation, and maybe this will be a way to help convince the other side that your point is valid?
I think that's a really good question, Andre. I think it is important for you to try to find a venue where the group to whom you're speaking is engaged and likely to see it. Now, that being said, if it's a partisan group or venue, it's particularly important, and this is important no matter where you publish it, to be balanced in how you're putting out your opinion. Because if you alienate people in your piece right from the beginning, they'll never get to your argument or hear your opinion. So it's important to be balanced in how you project that.
We have one in the chat. Do you list op-eds as publications on your CV? Does it get to be too many after a while?
Yeah, there's going to be a lot now. But I do list them on my CV, but I list them in a different section. So I have my scientific publications listed in one section, and then I have a public writing section where I list the op-eds. I think at some point I'm going to have to put together a WordPress website for them, and then perhaps just link from there.
Right.
But I've been quite surprised since I've taken on this hobby that I get a lot more engagement and input in my public writing in my professional life than I ever thought I would. So people will email me from within science. It definitely influenced my recent job transition to becoming a dean. So it can be a positive thing for your career as well. So I would definitely put it on your CV.
Great. So another question is, does the title of your op-ed matter? I.e., will you get more interest if you have a fancy title?
So the interesting thing about the title, which is why I didn't spend any time on it, is I've never published an op-ed where they use the title that I submitted. So places try to optimize the title for search engines and to get traffic to pieces on their websites. So I just usually try to have a title written really for the editor of the venue in which I'm submitting, so that they know what the piece is about in the subject line of my email, because it will always be changed.
Great. In terms of advocacy, how do you feel, or how effective do you feel that writing an op-ed is versus something like a letter writing campaign?
I think they're both important from an advocacy point of view. I think that writing an op-ed in a local newspaper, especially during a recess for Congress, for example, when people are back in their hometowns, can really have a big impact, because it can leverage local voices to provide feedback directly to your representatives. And so I think getting that discussion out in the public in a timely manner can really have an impact on people in a different way than a letter writing campaign can, because when you write a letter, it's a one-off. If you can influence people's thinking and then they act on that thinking, right? If your call to action was, call your representative who's home for the next 2 weeks, that could have a much larger impact.
Here's another one we have in the chat box. Do you have members of your target audience read your op-ed before submission to make certain the point that you're getting across is correct and on target?
Yeah, I never publish anything without having other people read it. I think that's really important. It's easy to get inside your own head, and your arguments are very clear to you, but they might not be as clear to other people. And so having those that share your opinion and those that don't share your opinion provide feedback is just a way to strengthen your op-ed, in my opinion.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions coming in. So for newspapers, should the number of words be less than 600 so that you can maximize your impact? So brevity as opposed to something long and drawn out?
Yep. So what I found is that different venues will actually give you guidance about how long they should be. So one of the op-eds I wrote was for the Arizona Daily Star, and I think their target was 450 words, whereas other venues, have been over 1,000 words. So that's another thing that you can look at on websites when you're thinking about where to send your piece, about what their guidelines are. The other thing I should mention is some places the editor will actually work with you to edit the initial draft that you submit. So for example, The Conversation will assign an editor to you if they're interested in your piece, and they'll work together to either lengthen or shorten or sharpen the focus of the argument that you're trying to make. So that's another variation on this theme.
Great. So in terms of national versus local papers, do you feel that there is it's easier to get your op-ed published in a smaller paper as opposed to a national paper? Does it depend on the topic? If one is a more national topic like funding for federal agencies, how do you feel those two venues differ in ease of access?
I think it's a lot like scientific journals. Of those 17 pieces, I sent a bunch of them to the New York Times, and I've not broken through yet. So I think it depends on the venue. And I really do think that the most important thing is the topic and the timeliness of it, and how the venue thinks their level of reader interest will be. So I think those are much more driving where pieces get in than whether they're national or local venues.
Great. So do you think it matters what position you have at your institution to get the attention of the editors, or should you not use your work title at all?
So I always use my work title. I do think, so at the bottom of the op-ed when you submit it, usually do a 1 or 2 line bio, and I've changed that depending on the topic of the piece. So I mentioned I've written as a mother, so I'll say something about, more of a personal bio, and I've written about science, and then I'll use my professional credentials. I think it's important to make it clear to the editor your expertise and therefore your ability to speak on the topic on which you've written.
Great. So if this is my first op-ed, what are some good topics, or where should I go? Should I just jump in the deep end? Or is there maybe get my feet wet with something simpler that may be easier to get published and that may give me more experience with writing op-eds?
Yeah, I think that for that, I think that question is really going to vary by person. For me, the easiest op-eds in terms of getting them written and submitted have been the things that I've been most passionate about because I've been thinking about them and I've been reading about them, and my ideas are more organized and collected in my head. So those have been the easiest ones for me. When I get an idea, a new idea, and I haven't really had the time to read much about it or see what's out there, and I start to try to write it, those are always much more difficult. So I would say start with something that you're passionate about and that you've been thinking about, and that'll be the easiest thing for you to write about.
Great. Okay, we have a couple of more questions. If there are any additional ones, please feel free to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A window. So we touched on this before, but could you give an idea of kind of the breadth of the types of op-eds that you've written, and maybe speak to how well each of or those topics in general were received?
Yeah, I've written about I think a pretty broad range of things from imposter syndrome to funding for research to the importance of basic research. I wrote about charter schools because one of my children had a charter school experience. I wrote about a place that I've gone for a small place that I've gone for vacation for the past 20 years. So a full range of different things. I've written about sexism in science. Um, and I've got the responses I've gotten have been a range. I would say the most negative things that I've gotten about are comments about the piece that I wrote about sexism in science, which is a difficult topic for people because I think they have vastly different experiences and perspectives. Um, so I think the feedback you get really varies quite a bit based on what you're writing. Um, when I was part of the op-ed project, they had this saying that I thought is really important, and it the phrase goes something like this: if you say something of consequence, there will be consequences. The alternative is to be inconsequential. So I think if you put yourself out there, you'll get both positive and negative, and the skew of what you get will vary by how controversial the topic is that you're writing about.
Great. And the last question I have speaks to kind of the type of op-ed. So if you choose to interview somebody in an op-ed, are there benefits there? Can you interview somebody as a part of an op-ed, and how does that affect the not the acceptance, but the how it's received, and if it's picked up by a venue?
I think so. In terms of interviewing for op-eds, given the length of them, the best that you can do is to try to use quotes or comments from other people as pieces of evidence in your argument. And I think that doing so can have an impact on the acceptance of your piece, depending on the stature of that person. If they're agreeing with your argument or not. So I think that that's the most straightforward way to incorporate interviewing into op-ed writing as pieces of evidence in support of your argument.
All right, great. That's our last question. I want to thank you again, Dr. Serio. This is very informative. Again, we will be posting, and if you've read the chat, we will be posting the recording of this webinar next week. We'll also be sending out an email notification to let everybody know that the webinar is live. We want to thank you all for your time. I want to thank Dr. Serio for carving out time in her busy, I'm sure it's super busy schedule to kind of give a talk about op-eds and grassroots. Again, ASBMB will be launching an initiative this month to encourage members and anybody in the science community, as well as science advocates, to write in their local papers, write in national papers, write wherever you can about the importance of science and how it impacts your life and your community. So, Dr. Serio, do you have any closing remarks?
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate you spending this time with me, and just give it a shot and see how it goes. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Great. Thank you all, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Thanks.
The chairperson has disconnected. The conference will now end.